Welcome to the flight levels. Instrument approach procedures are a great tool for pilots to stay above terrain and obstacles. However, they have limitations. Specifically, there are spots along instrument approaches that do not provide protection for pilots. Do you know where those are? Today, we're going to go over exactly how to find out where you're protected and where you are not. Let's get to it. Let's start with the basics of where instrument approach procedures do protect pilots. On the initial and intermediate segments of the approach, pilots are expected to stay within the lateral boundaries of each segment. If you're on a GPS approach, that means staying left or right of the center line by 1 mile, which is full deflection on your CDI. Or if you're flying a conventional nav approach, staying plus or minus 5 degrees of the center line of the course. And then on the final approach segment, if you're on a GPS approach, that means staying plus or minus 0.3 miles on either side of the center line. Or if you're following a localizer, that means slowly ramping down to about 700 feet either side of the center line when you're over the threshold. Now, when you're on the intermediate or initial segments of an approach, you are expected to stay above the minimum altitude presented on each segment. Pretty straightforward. But how about after you pass the final approach fix? Great. Well, then you can descend down to your minimum descent altitude or follow the glide path down to your decision altitude. And as you're doing that, you are protected. And as we know, to descend below the MDA, you need to have the holy trinity of 91.175, which includes having the runway environment in sight, having the required visibility of the approach, as well as constantly being in a position to use normal maneuvers and normal rate of descent to safely come down to the runway. Now, just because you have fulfilled the 3 holy trinity requirements of 91.175 does not guarantee you any protection whatsoever. I know this seems like a shock. How can this be, Joe? The instrument approach procedures are safe and they protect you. There are 0 approaches that give you protection below DA or MDA. And the AIM has a specific statement that describes this. Let's take a look. So if we take a look at AIM paragraph 5-4-5, which covers instrument approach procedures, we have statement I. There is no implicit obstacle protection from the MDA/DA to the touchdown point. Did you hear that? No implicit obstacle protection from the MDA or DA to the touchdown point. Accordingly, it is the responsibility of the pilot to visually acquire and avoid obstacles below the MDA or DA during transition to landing. Full stop. There are no exceptions for day versus night. There's no exceptions of anything. Anytime you go below MDA or DA, there are 0 protections provided. Now, it is not all doom and gloom. It does not mean that we are all rolling the dice on any instrument approach. There are some protections, and there are ways to identify when we have them on each instrument approach plate. Let's take a closer look. Now, before we get into the symbology on the instrument approach plates, we need to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the procedures that the FAA uses to evaluate each airport when designing instrument approach procedures. So, what they like to do is make some imaginary slopes out from the end of the runway, starting 200 feet prior to the threshold, and they extend them out along their approach corridor at 2 different slopes. The first one is a pretty shallow slope of 34:1. So for clarity, that means for every 34 feet you go out horizontally, you go up 1 foot. And this ends up being a very shallow angle of about 1.68 degrees. Another slope that they send out at that same 200 foot before the threshold is at 20:1. Again, this means for every 20 feet you go out, you go up 1 foot. And this ends up being about 2.87 degrees. And you eagle-eye pilots out there will notice that 2.87 is just shy of that standard 3 degrees. That'll come in handy in a minute here. Now, once they project these two different slopes out from the approach end of the runway, they took a look and see, are there any obstacles that penetrate either the 34-to-1 slope or the 20-to-1 slope? And we're going to take a look at the results of if obstacles penetrate one, the other, or neither. Now, before we get into these different symbologies and what they mean, I need to make a clarifying statement here. So if you're flying a precision approach, specifically one where you're following a glide path all the way down to a decision altitude, generally speaking, the space between your decision altitude and the runway is generally pretty short. Now, while we just talked about the AIM saying there is no assurance of obstacle clearance during this phase of flight, it's not very far, and you're very likely to be pretty well safe and protected. So flying an ILS or an LPV approach, you're in pretty good shape as long as you follow the glide path all the way down to decision altitude, and then of course still fulfill the Holy Trinity requirements of 91.175. Everything we're talking about beyond this point is specifically for non-precision approaches, and the symbology, the symbols that we're going to be covering are specific to non-precision approaches. Great, so let's take a look at a real-world example. So here we have the RNAV approach to runway 2 at Sacramento Executive. And for those of you not familiar with Sacramento, it's a pretty flat place with some rivers going through it, and other than a couple radio towers in some specific places, it's a pretty flat place. So on this specific approach, we can see we have, of course, we have LPV, LNAV, and circling options available to runway 2. You will also notice a symbol that you may be familiar with, this bold V, which of course is the symbol for a VDP or visual descent point. We also have, if we follow the approach closer to the runway, we have this light shaded gray arrow going all the way down to the runway threshold. So the inclusion of both this VDP and this light gray arrow means that when the evaluators went out to Sacramento Executive and they put out those two slopes, that there were no obstacles penetrating either the 34-to-1 slope or the 20-to-1 slope. So this means that if you were to follow this approach as a non-standard approach using just the LNAV minimums, and you were to pass the final approach fix of Seabay, and then you were to go down to 700 feet down to Woodrow, and then past Woodrow, you would go down to your MDA of 400 feet. And then upon passing the VDP at 1 nautical mile to runway 2, and you began a nice, standard 3-degree descent profile down to the runway, you are very likely not to hit anything, because on that evaluation, there were no obstacles that even hit the 34-to-1 or the less than 2-degree slope out there. So the inclusion of the VDP and this light gray arrow gives you some pretty good reassurance that there's not a lot of stuff to hit out here. So then moving on to another Northern California airport, and you'll notice we're talking about Northern California a lot because I used to fly there a lot, so I'm very familiar with these approaches. So let's take a look at Livermore, California, and the localizer approach to runway 25 right. Now, we will notice that similar to the approach at Sacramento, it does have a VDP. However, you will notice it is missing that light gray arrow. And this means that when the FAA was taking observations at Livermore, the 34-to-1 slope was penetrated by some obstacle. And that's how we know that has happened, because there's no gray arrow. Now the VDP is still there because no obstacles penetrated the 20-to-1 slope. So let's take an example here. So let's say we're flying along this approach and we're at 3,100 feet coming up to the final approach fix of Jusum. We pass Jusum, we descend down to the next step down fix of 2,520 feet until we get to Hynix. Then we descend down to 2,000 feet until we get to Zabgo. And then we can descend down all the way to our minimum descent altitude of 1,080 feet. We stay there. At some point, we fulfill the holy trinity of 91.175, get the runway environment in sight, and the other two things. And then we get to 2.9 DME from the localizer antenna, which is where the VDP is. At this point, we can descend at that 3-degree angle. That's pretty standard. And technically, you wouldn't hit anything. However, since that 20-to-1 slope is only 2.87 degrees, it is entirely possible that some obstacle came right up below that slope. So just because there's a VDP there doesn't mean you are totally in the clear. There could be some obstacle just lurking that just missed that 20-to-1 slope. So you never want to assume, even with a VDP, that you are totally in the clear. It just means there's no monster obstacles because they didn't penetrate the 20-to-1 slope. So let's move on and see the next example and see what we have there. Okay, so regular viewers of my channel, I don't think you're going to be surprised that the next approach we're looking at is Steamboat Springs in the RNAV Zulu to runway 32. So with our newfound wisdom of these obstacle evaluations and the different slopes and then the different symbols used to identify if things penetrate these slopes, let's take a closer look. Oh, and what a shocker. We're going to notice that this approach does not have either the VDP, nor does it have the shaded gray arrow. So with our newfound wisdom, what does this mean? This means that when the FAA took a look at this approach, they sent out that 34-to-1 slope and that 20-to-1 slope, and they realized that some obstacle penetrated both of these slopes, and hence there are no visual descent points nor any shaded arrows. So what does this mean for you when you're flying this approach? This means that as we pass the final approach fix of Mabkey, we can descend down to the MDA of 9,100 feet. And then we need to fulfill the holy trinity of 91.175, which let's go ahead and review it. That means we have the runway environment in sight. It means we have the required visibility of the approach. And it also means we are going to be using normal maneuvers and normal rates of descent to get down to the runway. We also now know that the aim, paragraph 5-4-5, says there is no implicit obstacle protection from the MDA or decision altitude to the touchdown point. Accordingly, it is the responsibility of the pilot to visually acquire and avoid obstacles below the MDA or DA during transition to landing. Sorry to harp on this, but they're pretty clear on this, and it's important for all pilots to understand this. So here's another way to think about having VDPs and the shaded gray arrows on your approach plates. Instead of looking for them to be present, the real way to look at this is the absence of a VDP should be your clue that, attention, there's no VDP. That means there is an obstacle that penetrated the 20-to-1 slope. And that means you need to be on high alert that something is out there and you need to be ready to see and avoid this obstacle. Now, the last thing I want to cover today is which runway you are ultimately going to be landing on. Now, if your destination is a towered airport, the approach controller is going to assign you a runway. So for example, you could be assigned to, or rather cleared for an approach, and you're just going to land on that runway. If the winds favor some other runway, or just the airport is running operations to a different runway, the approach controller is going to assign you cleared for such approach, circle to runway, whatever one the tower needs you to land on. Now, at a non-towered airport, radar controllers do not have jurisdiction over the runways. They are only clearing you for the approach. They cannot clear you to land. Therefore, at a non-towered airport, the approach controller will never, ever, ever specifically assign you to go straight in or to circle. That is a thing that never happens. That is always the pilot's discretion. Okay, and this brings me to a little bit of a rant, so buckle up. There has been a lot of chatter about the alleged safety in FAA instrument approach plates. And there's a lot of folks that are saying that they suck, they're dangerous, and we need to get rid of some approaches that are inherently dangerous. Okay, well, you know, that is a legitimate stance, and you are welcome to that opinion. But here's the thing. If that's the metric we're using of, you know, approaches are dangerous, or if there's obstacles between the final approach fix and the runway, do you really want the government deciding which approaches to shut down or not? I sure don't. If that is the metric, we're going to be shutting down thousands of approaches that people use every day without a problem. Or is the solution better training of pilots? And, you know, that's what I'm trying to do here with this channel. And that's why I'm trying to bring a focus to these chart symbols of VDPs and this light gray shaded arrow so that pilots can understand, you know, not only what they mean, but the significance of what it means when they're not there. So I respect everyone's opinion, and if you think some approaches are inherently dangerous, you know, you are welcome to that. But if your solution is telling the FAA that they need to remove approaches because some are dangerous, I think you need to be careful, because counting on them to decide what's safe and what's not, or which ones to remove and which ones to keep, I think that is a gigantic mistake. I think the better answer is counting on the existing procedures being very good and pilots getting better training and understanding what's on these approaches and what are their responsibilities. What do you guys think? Thanks for watching, everyone. You know, here at the Flight Levels, we're pretty proud that we've just passed some pretty big milestones. We just hit over 1,200 subscribers, and we also just surpassed 4,000 hours viewed. So thank you to everyone for watching these videos, and I hope you continue to tune in. So tell me, what do you guys think? Are these clear as mud? Does the FAA need to do a better job explaining this to pilots? Or is this the fault of flight instructors not clearly explaining this to students? What do you guys think? All right, have a good one. We'll see you guys next week.